Well, thank you for being here, everybody. We're going to get started and try to maximize the teaching time for this afternoon. So I just want to do a couple of quick things. Again, we are welcoming the Salts family with us to be here tonight. Jared's the one teaching, but we're glad that all four of you are here. And so anyway, I feel like, you know how families have family friends? And I feel like church families should have family friends as well. And you guys are now becoming some family friends of Northside, which is super cool. So we're glad to have you guys with us. I'm glad everybody's decided to be here this afternoon, made your time to be here. We're going to do the same format that we did last time. We're going to let Jared have 45 to 50 minutes. And then just whenever he calls it, whenever he's done, we're going to take a 10-minute break and gather up some of your questions. Then we'll do some question and response at the table after that. Yeah, there are worksheets back there, notes pages, unless you're like me and you find it easier to just take your own notes, which I will be doing. But if you want some of those, you can run back there and grab one and not feel like you're disturbing anybody. Just go for it. And then there's also index cards that I have that I can pass around here in just a second if anybody wants to have some of those to write down your questions for the second part of this afternoon's session. So that's, I think, everything that I intended to cover to just get us going. Jim's going to lead a prayer and ask God to bless Jared as he speaks to us and as he teaches us. So Jim's got a mic. He's going to go ahead and do that from right back there.
Let's bow. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this another opportunity we have to get together and look at some of your word. We thank you for Jared and his presence here today. We're thankful for all who are here. We pray that our time together will be profitable and that we will learn better how to please you, that by looking at certain themes, we can recognize the way your word flows and how it really can be understood. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Well, I successfully made it through last time without absolutely just going crazy trying to sit down while teaching. So we can see if we can make it a second time in a row for my news anchor-y feeling. It's like tonight with Dan Rather. I don't know if that's me, but we'll see if we can make it work. So how's y'all's week been so far? I mean, I know you're like 3/4 of a day into it, but so far so good? Good. Okay. So we're talking about the Exodus, and you guys have been talking a lot about the Exodus. I hear Dan did the third command, or the third lesson for talking about taking God's name in vain, or not taking it and speaking it, but what? What are you talking about this morning? Bearing it. Yeah, bearing God's name. And it's interesting how so often the words that we use, even if they're not in the text, they sort of get brought into it and thought about it and changes it. And when we go back and look at the text a little closer, what sometimes we can realize. And that's what I want to do with us this afternoon, is to go back and look a little closer at some texts, particularly here from David's life, and see if we can hear echoes of the Exodus in there. You know, out here you get a lot of space. You know, any of you yell out across a canyon or something, you hear an echo coming back. What is an echo? Give me, the fancy scientific explanation or just the regular one. The reflection of sound, yeah. And there's all sorts of things that dictate how good the echo that comes back for you is, right? There's an optimal distance, clarity, how good the kind of the wall that you're bringing it back into is, all sorts of things. And we all know that sometimes you get a little garbled. The echo's not exactly right because of the intervening space. But as long as it's close enough to recognize, it's still an echo. And I want us to be thinking about that as we go through the David story. But one thing before we jump into that, and that is we've been asking this question about what makes an Exodus. We're going to keep coming back to this a little bit differently each week, but we talked a little bit about it last time. You've thought about it some. What makes an Exodus? Not the Exodus, but an Exodus. What's something that happens that makes an Exodus? Yeah, leaving one spot, going to another. Is it generally, you just happen to take a trip? You're like, hey, I'm going to go on down to Denver, what? being freed from slavery. A really important aspect is being freed from the shadow of slavery. What else? What generally connects things for an Exodus? Yeah. People getting killed, that is a lot of times what happens. Not every time, but a whole lot of time. Glad to see we're focused on the important parts here. What else? Is that a hand up? Yeah, it's not always just one or two people. A lot of times it's a lot of people, all right? We see this a lot of different times. Oh yeah, definitely. If you got Moses there, it's for sure in Exodus. But sometimes it's someone who looks like Moses, not exactly Moses himself. We got to kind of pay attention to what makes somebody a Moses. We might think about how this plays out. Remember when the Jews come and they ask John the Baptist if he's Elijah, and he answers what? No. But when Jesus talks about him, what does he say? He's Elijah if you believe, if you know how to look, if you understand what that means. Because he's not literally Elijah, right? But he's, we would say, an Elijah. And if you know to understand what that looks like, all of a sudden you know, oh, he's this Elijah character, and he's going to be doing this and this and this. And you look at John's life, and he does those same things, wears the same clothes, in the same part of the world, preaching the same message. And you know what's coming from that. Dan, you had your hand up. What else makes an Exodus? A miraculous deliverance, yeah. A lot of times you get plagues. That's a really good tip-off. If God's bringing plagues against somebody to free someone, you're in pretty good spot for that being an Exodus. A lot of times you're going to go through water. A lot of times you're going to be in the wilderness for a while. Sometimes God gives you a new law while you're there. And ultimately, if we think about the beginning of the Exodus or Annexus being slavery, the end is where? The promised land. Yes, I see your hand up. A longing for deliverance. I love how you say that, a longing for deliverance. And sometimes the people don't know what they're wanting to be delivered from, though, right? They're thinking physically, and God's thinking spiritually, but really, really like that point. So we've seen and talked about a few of these as we've gone through, just to kind of use the same verbiage so that we're all on the same page. You're enslaved in a foreign land. You're going to be freed by someone special that God sends, generally a prophet. Generally speaking, a lot of times God's judging the foreign gods and idolatrous powers. He brings them through water. He gives them a covenant. They wander in the wilderness. God is in their midst, and he's seeking to bring them to a promised land. And when you see those sorts of things, you can feel safe that you're in an Exodus. But we see these lots of places. Now, I know we're going back to Genesis. Had to do it a little bit. Give some continuity for last year, since last year's last time I seen some of y'all. The kids are bigger this time around. That makes it fun. But let's think about Genesis for a second. Because there are a few different things that look a little bit like an Exodus, and one that looks a lot of bit like an Exodus. Think about the first time we get someone down in Egypt in the book of Genesis. Maybe, say, chapter 12. You remember the story? There's a famine in the land, and Abraham goes down to Egypt. Now what happens? What does Abraham tell his sister or his wife to tell everybody? Spoiled that one just a little bit, right? Because what's he worried is going to happen to her? Or him, actually. He's not really worried about her. He's going to get killed. So what happens? They get down, they see she's beautiful, and they take her. She is, in a way, enslaved. Now, do you remember what happens down there? Someone turn over if you want, if you can't remember off the top of your head. Go to Genesis chapter 12, verse 17. Do you remember what happens when Sarah's taken into Pharaoh's harem? How does God get her out? What does it say in verse 17? Yeah, he gives them boils. He gives them plagues. Now, if God's bringing plagues on people in Egypt and Pharaoh's house in order to get his people free, and notice what happens. Look in verse 20. What happens? Pharaoh does what? He is going to do something this time. He sends, get up and go. It's the same phrase that Pharaoh tells the Israelites in Exodus. Now, remember, in the Exodus, capital E, do the Israelites leave without any compensation for their slavery and the harm that's been caused them? No, what do they come out with? Yeah, they plunder the Egyptians. And look what happens in this case. When Abraham leaves, what has he already gotten in verse 16 from Pharaoh and the Egyptians? So, someone is enslaved. God sends plagues to free them. Pharaoh says, get up and go, and they go out with more stuff than they had. What does that look like? It's a foreshadowing of the Exodus, isn't it? And we might not have thought about that before as we're reading rapidly through Genesis chapter 12, but when you slow down and you look at the points, you can see some of those things. And although less specific, that same story of the Exodus, that general story, that sort of slightly distorted echo, you can see not only in Abraham's life, but you can see it in Jacob's story. Think about, now he's not enslaved in Egypt. He goes north, but he's in a foreign land. He receives temporary protection, just like Moses had. He's fruitful and multiplies while he's there, just like Israel does in Canaan. Then remember what happens. Why is he going to leave? Because his host becomes jealous of his sort of fertility and growth and everything else of that nature. He has to flee in the middle of the night in order to escape death. God brings him out. They encounter God in the wilderness, and then God brings him back to the promised land. And you go through that, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's a foreshadowing of the Exodus in Jacob's life. If we looked at Joseph's life, it's even clearer. I mean, it helps when you're going down to Egypt, right? But what happened? Why is he brought down to Egypt? He is made what? Into a slave. And God has to free him. And think about how he does that, right? How he's been taken advantage of. He's brought into Pharaoh's house, much like Moses is, right? He serves to bring a blessing to Israel and the world. And to make it even clearer, remember, where is Joseph buried at the end of Genesis? He's buried in Egypt. But do you remember? Yeah, he says, when God brings you out, take my bones with you. It's a foreshadowing of the Exodus. We could look at others if we had more time, but you can see this all over the place in the prophets. For example, we'll just look at one example, at two, because we've got more, but we'll only look at two. In Isaiah, if you go to Isaiah chapter 40, then what we have in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, is there's a voice in the wilderness saying, make straight the way of the Lord. Well, you've got a voice crying out in the wilderness. Or in chapter 43, verses 16 and 17, God, you're the one who makes a path through the sea, who brings out the chariot and the horse, the army and the warrior. I mean, what's that talking about? When does God make a path through the sea? It's Moses in Egypt, the chariot and the rider. God's here is bringing them through the sea. He says in chapter 43, verse 20, when I bring you back to me, I'm going to give you water in the midst of the wilderness. We've seen that one before. Or even in chapter 44, verse 7, God asks a very specific question that has a very specific echo. He says, who is like me? Do you remember the opening phrase that Moses sings at the Song of the Sea? Who is like the Lord? And this is God asking that same question as he's about to bring them out. He says in chapter 44, verse 27, he's the one who says to the sea, be dry, and he dries it up and opens a path. If we jump forward to 45, verse 14, he says, the wealth of Egypt will become yours. Well, now at the end of Isaiah, when he's looking forward to bringing them out, they're not in Egypt, are they? Where are the people going to be enslaved in a foreign land across a river? In Babylon. So welcome to Babylon, which is the same as Egypt. And now he's not freeing them by bringing through the Nile, but by bringing them across the river of the Euphrates. That if you go through Isaiah, then God says, hey, I've done this before. I'm going to do it again. I've saved you from slavery where you went down and brought you to my promised land once. And I'm going to do it again. Over and over and over, God uses this image, this echo of Egypt and slavery in the Exodus to tell them not only what he's done, but what he's going to do. We might think of Hosea's famous history lesson that becomes a prophecy, out of Egypt I called my son. Where does Matthew use that phrase to talk about? The exodus of Israel from Egypt? No, he uses it to talk about what, Dan? They come back from Egypt and bring Jesus. So in Hosea, it's both a history lesson and it's a prophecy. That we see that God has ways of doing things that he does. We talked a little bit last time about in the Gospels, but in Matthew, it's very, very clear. We've already seen out of Egypt, I called my son. Where does they flee like Moses, right? A child that's not supposed to be alive after a king who wants to put out a rebellion kills all the boys in the area. I mean, that's Exodus, right? They go to Egypt, which is reversed, but then he bring it back in that sort of a way. They cross then after the Red Sea. Now it's not the sea, but it's the Jordan River where he is baptized not into Moses, but into the Spirit. Or we see then, what does Israel do after they come out of the Red Sea? They go into the wilderness. How long are they in the wilderness? 40 years. How long is Jesus in the wilderness immediately after he comes to the river? 40 days, right? The same number of 40, where he's also tested. And then they come to the mountain, right? In Exodus chapter 19, they come to Mount Sinai and God gives them the law. What is the first thing that Matthew has Jesus do after he's tested in the wilderness? He goes up on top of a mountain and he does what? Tells them, you have heard, but I'm telling you now. He gives the Sermon on the Mount, including a new law. A new law for a new people. And he's promising to bring them into a land of rest. It is a re-echo or an interpretation or replayment of the Exodus. And again, we could keep on seeing it. If you went over, we don't have time to do all of these, but if you went over to Acts chapter 12, you remember when Peter's in prison? We know Acts pretty well. Do you remember what day it is when Peter gets pulled into prison in Acts chapter 12, verse 3? Take a guess. Huh? It could be, but it's going to be a Jewish holiday that maybe is related to what we're talking about. It's the Passover, right? And you remember he's being persecuted by a ruler who has already killed some of God's people, who's acting like Pharaoh, and the people cry out for deliverance. That's what, Rob had already brought up. They're longing for deliverance. And who shows up to Peter when he's in prison? Do you remember in chapter 12, verse 7? An angel, right? And do you remember what the angel tells him in verse 8? He says, you should have had your sandals on. Now, when has God told his people they're supposed to have their staff in their hand and their sandals on? It's the Passover. And God's angel says, buddy, you should have known this. It's the Passover. What do we do on the Passover? We bring you out of bondage. Get your shoes on. Let's go. I love the angel has to slap them to wake them up. It's a very funny story if you just read that again. And the angel's like, how have you not realized that this is what's going to happen? And do you remember whose house he goes to when he gets released? Oh, whose name is? What's Mary's Hebrew name? No, that's her sister. Good guess. Miriam. Of course, right? Moses' sister. God's telling us, pay attention. This is what we do. And even if we wanted to look elsewhere, again, we could spend, all day looking at these little minor echoes of the Exodus. But in Hezekiah, when he's surrounded by the Assyrians, do you remember how they get saved? They're crying out, it's the middle of the night, and who shows up? Not just any angel, but the angel of death. Hey, when's the last time we saw that guy? The Exodus. And he brings a plague that destroys them, and the people are freed. And do you remember what the people celebrate right afterwards? Take a guess. What holiday? The Passover, of course. If we wanted to look at Esther, we don't have time to do this. You see the whole thing as a retelling of the Exodus story. And although it becomes the blessing of Purim, that when those lots are cast, it's on the Passover. And the idea is, of course, God's going to bring his people out from bondage. If we wanted to look at Revelation, then the story of what happens to the woman being chased by the dragon is also a retelling of the Exodus. over and over and over from the very first book of the Bible to the very last book of the Bible, God's trying to tell us something. He says, this is how I save my people. And if we wanted to think about it just for a moment for our own lives, isn't that how he does it with us too? I mean, we know the passage. While we were yet what? Christ died for us? Sinners. While we were enslaved to our sin, Jesus becomes the Passover lamb who brings us out of bondage. And how does he do it? We have to go through baptism. We go through the water. And all of us today in our lives, where are we right now? We're living in the wilderness. We're freed from bondage, but we've not arrived at that land of rest. We've been given God's law that's meant to transform us, and he's bringing us someplace. And the question is, as we're being tested in our 40, 50, 60, 70, however many years, the question is, are we going to make it to the promised land, or are we going to die on the way in rebellion against God? Jesus says, God says, his Spirit says, this is how we do things. Be listening for echoes. See how God does this. See what he's longing to do. So those are all kind of short little episodes, single stories, a single chapter, a few verses, that are little minor echoes for the Exodus. But what I want to look at for the rest of our time today is a bigger echo of the Exodus. We talked last time about how 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 7 are one retelling of the Exodus. We're going to look at another retelling of the Exodus. We could, if we'd had more time, we could have looked how, yes, 1 Samuel chapter 8 through chapter 15 is also a retelling of the Exodus. We don't have time to do all of them, but you can go ahead and look at that yourself. But we're going to look at how David's life is Exodus shaped. But we're going to do it in maybe a weird way to start it with, okay? We're going to go to the Psalms, okay? Now, I'm going to put these up there so we don't have to spend a ton of time looking around, but you feel free to do so. Because when you read through the Psalms, if you sort of half closed your eyes and you ignored all the references to the king, you would think David was Moses. Let me explain what I mean by this. What I mean is if you consider how many David's Psalms, some of the lines and the language he uses, looks a whole lot like Moses. For example, we'll start and we'll work our way a little bit more specific as we go. So in chapter 143, verse 8, David says, my fortunes changed all of a sudden in the morning. It was bad at the night, but it comes in the morning. He said earlier in chapter 7 that I'm being pursued by enemies and the waters are coming up to my neck in chapter 69. And he's rescued many times by the sound of rushing waters. And he sees his enemies fall into the trap that they'd set, and he's brought out from this shaky ground onto firm ground. He sees God present in the skies and in the clouds, and he sees the angel of the Lord camped in front and then behind him leading his way. We say, hang on a second. That language, if we just pulled those little pieces out, that looks a whole lot like Moses going to the sea. I mean, isn't that how we have it played out? That God says, they're going to be there. Remember, they're crying all night long, and God says, be silent and wait for the morning, and God's going to bring redemption. Or we see in Exodus 12 that they're going to go through the midst of these mighty rushing waters, that the enemies are pursuing him, but they're going to be, they think they're going to trap him against the sea, and then they get consumed by the waters themselves. And then Moses comes out, and they walk through on solid ground. And you say, whoa, Jared, I think maybe that's a little overreading. It's a little loose. It's not very clear. That's a bad echo. But if we look a little further, if we think a little bit more, then we keep on seeing these things. Psalm 18 specifically praises God for parting the sea with his wind. Now that's a little closer. Because remember, when they come to the Red Sea, how does God part it? With his wind. Yeah, David doesn't do anything that we know of about being near the sea. He's running around in the desert and the mountains, but he's seeing and hearing and seeing his life in the same way as God has done things before. Or we might look at how he rejoices over those who trust in horses and chariots. And it's a big deal. How does Pharaoh pursue Israel when they go into the sea? With his horse and his chariot. Remember the song of the sea in Exodus chapter 15? Pharaoh's horse and his chariot, he's thrown into the sea. He rejoices against those. We read specifically that he worships the God of the rock and whom he longs for water when he's in the middle of the desert. And you're like, wait a second. I mean, yes, that happens for him, but the way that he sees this, he celebrates the gift of God's law and looks forward to God bringing him back home to the promised land. And as you look through all of that, you understand something, I think. And that is that David looks at his life through the lens of what God has already done for Israel with Moses. That one of the things David gains faith from is he says, wait a second, if God saved Moses in all these situations, he can save me too. If God cared about Moses in all those times, he can care about me too. And it's not like David's looking for a one-to-one correspondence. He doesn't think he's a Levite, for example. He doesn't think that he's being taken out of Egypt. He's not trying to say that, I struck a rock with my staff and water came out. But he is saying in his life, hey, other people have gone through this before, and God saved them. And he's seeing himself in that way. And I think as we go through the story of David in 1 and 2 Samuel, I hope that you can see David's life a little bit more in that way too, so that we can see our own lives in that same shape and shadow. So hold this for a second. You don't have to buy it. I'm not asking you to buy it or a vowel or anything else, but just keep this in mind for a second. Take it up, plop it over here, new sheet of paper in our mind for a second. With this in mind, let's get into the story. Let's go the place that we all kind of think about. If there's one event from David's life we think about a lot of times, what is it? What's the most exciting event for you guys in David's life? Defeating Goliath, right? So let's go over to 1 Samuel chapter 17. You can feel free to jump over there. We're going to spend a little bit more time here rather than jumping all around. Let's think for a second about the situation here, okay? Who is David at this point? He's a shepherd who's killed a lion and a bear. Does Saul know who he is? Not really. At least not depending on how you're going to go with chapter 17. Yes, in chapter 16. That's a whole other conversation. But what's the problem with Goliath? What's he been doing? Taunting them. How long has he been taunting them? 40 days and 40 nights. Yeah, we're like all of a sudden we're already jumping on that train a little bit. And do you remember when David shows up in verse 26, it's not just that he's been taunting Israel, he's been insulting whom? He's made this a contest between what? God, right? He's taunting their God. This contest isn't just about two guys. It isn't even just about two nations. It's about the fight and who is more powerful between their God and the Lord of heaven and earth. Now, we saw this played out already when they brought him to the temple of Dagon of the Philistines. Which God won? Our God won. They have not caught the picture yet, okay? And what they're going to see is that David understands this is a fight between the gods. Who can read chapter 17, verses 45 through 47? Let's see how David sees this. Chapter 17, verses 45 through 47.
So, in verse 45, Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I have come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands.
So notice, what does David say this is really about? Giving God the glory. And we're going to see that God is more powerful than anybody else. And one last thing, he says, so that who will know? All the people will know what? That the Lord is God. Now, wait a second. What does Moses say the purpose of the plagues was in the Exodus? So that all the people will know that the Lord is God. If we wanted to look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, we referenced this last week, but God says, I'm going to pass through Egypt on that night. I'm going to strike down every firstborn male of the land of Egypt, people and animals, and I am the Lord, and I will execute judgments against all of the gods of Egypt. That God's saying, this is so that everybody knows that I am more powerful than their gods. The situation then here with David and Goliath is similar to the situation as there in Egypt. They're in slavery, really, to the Philistines. They're the ones who are oppressed. They're the ones who need to be brought out, even though they're in the midst of their own land. And David recognizes that he's going to do this not because he's powerful, not with sword or bow, but because God is more powerful than these other gods, and he's going to bring them out. And we go through a little bit more. There's minor echoes in how these things work. Hold on a second, you'll see where I think we're going once we get there. Let's consider how the prophets describe Pharaoh. This may surprise folks a little bit. In Isaiah chapter 51, verse 9, this goes back to what we're talking about, how the prophets see saving them out of Persia as a second Exodus. But he describes Pharaoh in this way. In the chapter of 51, he's talking about the king of Egypt. But he describes in this way. He says, wake up, arm of the Lord. Clothe yourself in strength. Wake up as you have in the past, as in generations long ago. And although he's talking about Pharaoh, he says, wasn't it you who hacked the sea monster Rahab to pieces and who pierced the sea monster? And you're thinking, that's weird. Or if we looked in Ezekiel, it makes it a little more clear. Ezekiel 29, verse 3, look, I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster lying in the midst of the Nile River, who says, my Nile is my own, and I make it myself. Pharaoh is like a sea monster who's God's enemy. So when God splits the sea there in Exodus 15, he is destroying Pharaoh's power in a weird way that the prophets see as intimately connected. But what's Goliath wearing? Who is their God? Remember, who's the Philistines' God? His name is, we talked about this last week, Dagon, and he is a god of the sea, and the Philistines are from the sea. And we read specifically that the kind of armor that Goliath is wearing is what? Anybody know? This would be in verse, What's he wearing? Scales. But it's scales. He's bedecked like a sea monster. And of course, God is going to split him in half, as it were. He's going to, we might say, if we're going to look for it a little where we're going by the end of class, what does David do to him after he strikes him in the head? He cuts off its head. There's a little bit of an echo of a different serpent that a different son of David is going to destroy the head of there in this way as well. But it's a similar sort of a situation there, a similar sort of description of Pharaoh and Goliath. There's a little bit of an echo there. But we can get a little bit closer if we go forward one more time, because as we think about what happens, and the description is true of David too. What was Moses doing before he saves the people? What's David been doing before he saves the people? He's a shepherd, right? We know where this is going. We know they've both been tested for 40 days. That's in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 16. But look at the result as well. We all know David strikes him with the rock. He cuts off his head. They flee, they pursue, they destroy the Philistine army. But look at chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Let's see the result of the situation. Chapter 10 and 11, verses 10 and 11, sorry. What is the response of the people? Chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Who's got that? You got that? Chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18, verses 10 and 11. Can you read that for me?
6 and 7. Or singing.
Why did I say 10 and 11? I was looking, did I put my note wrong? Yes, I do mean when people are singing. And particularly playing what? What do they do?
They're playing tambourines,
Oh.
singing songs of joy.
Says, can you read that for me?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, I gave you the wrong verse.
That's okay. 18, 6 and 7. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s.
Now, after Moses, or God really, has destroyed Pharaoh and his army, they've come through the sea. Do you remember what they do in Exodus chapter 15, verses 20 and 21? Who sings the song? Sorry? The women do, and they play tambourines. Is it exact? No. But you line all these things up, and if you're David and you've lived through it, it's going to feel similar to an Exodus. The same beginning, same middle, and same end. And David's like, this is weird. This keeps happening in my life. Because in the middle part of David's life, that part where he's running around in the wilderness, here was chapter 18, verses 10 through 11 that I jumped the gun on a little bit. Think about how this plays out. After an attempt at salvation of the people, remember when Moses tries to save the people when he's young, and he's 40, and he kills the Egyptian, and the king finds out, and what does the king try to do? Kill him. What's Saul going to do after this attempt at salvation? Look at verses 10 and 11. He's going to try and kill him, right? It's like David's like, if you're like David, you're like, man, I got away from the spear of Goliath, and now I've got Saul throwing a spear at me. Not once, but twice. I would have left her the first spear cast. David's sticking around longer than I would. I feel like if someone throws a spear at you, you can leave. David waits for 2 times. That's his own thing. But as Saul keeps on trying to kill him, do you remember what happens in chapter 19, verses 11 through 17? Who does David end up marrying first? Saul's daughter. And remember, Saul wants to kill him? How does Saul's daughter, or who saves him? It's Saul's daughter. How does she save him? It's in the middle of the night. She covers up with a cloak, but she puts something on top of the head for hair. It's a goat skin hair. And you read that, and you're like, wait a second. I've seen something like this before. Remember when the king of Egypt is trying to kill all the Israelite boys? How come Moses doesn't die? His mom saves him, but then who saves him after that? Pharaoh's own daughter saves him. Yeah, the daughter of the king who's trying to kill him saves him. You're like, I mean, how many times does this happen in the Bible? Not that often. And when you hear that and you see that, when they are going to go out from the Passover, it's in the middle of the night that God's going to bring them out, and not through the hair of a goat, but through the blood of the lamb. But there's something there that just sort of tickles our memory a little bit here. Pharaoh has brought his, eventually, the person who's going to bring about his demise into his house the same way that Saul does. They're both trying to kill them. And we read as we go through that the new Pharaoh, Saul, hardens his heart and keeps on trying to kill David. If we move forward into the wilderness, the same sorts of things. What feeds the Israelites in the wilderness? Manna from heaven, holy bread, special bread. When David's running around in the wilderness and he's trying to escape from Saul, do you remember where he takes his pit stop at in chapter 19? He stops at the tabernacle and he gets the holy bread. Now, is he technically supposed to eat that bread? No. But also, yes, it's a weird sort of situation if you read how Jesus talks about this in Matthew. but he's fed by bread in the wilderness. Again, not exactly, but it feels pretty similar. I mean, even if we look through how that plays out with that sort of situation, it looks similar in terms of his allies. We remember who are the Israelites that are always grumbling and complaining, they're malcontents. And the people specifically that are around David, they're called malcontents. Now, they're not grumbling at David, but they're grumbling at everything else. Typical group of Israelites in there. And his enemies are even the same. That he's going to be attacked by this guy, Doeg the Edomite. Or specifically, the major enemy he runs into before he becomes king are the Amalekites, who are, of course, that big problem in the wilderness that Moses says, don't ever forget the Amalekites and wage war against them. There's all these little things that are playing out in this. And one more. If we're a while on this page, and I know we're going relatively fast, y'all can ask some questions if we want to clear up some of these a little bit later. Moses has 2 songs that sort of guide his life. The first is after that salvation at the Song of the Sea, and the second is at the very end in Deuteronomy chapter 32, where he praises specifically God for being his rock. David also has 2 songs that he sings in his life. The first is after the final salvation of his from Saul there in 2 Samuel chapter 1. But at the very end of his life, he also has 2 Samuel 23, where we read the same phrase, the God of Israel spoke, the rock of Israel said to me, the one who rules the people with justice, rules in the fear of God. Both have echoes of each other. And again, not specific. These aren't crystal clear. They're not exactly the same thing. But they're the way God tends to tell stories. And we're intended, I think, to pick up on that. I think a lot about how Paul talks about this and hearing these sorts of echoes in Galatians. Do you remember in Galatians and in Corinthians, Paul's talking about how we are supposed to read the law, and he says, hey, by the way, when the Israelites were going through the wilderness, who was the rock that followed them? It's Christ. How many of us read Numbers or Exodus, either way of striking the rock, and we're like, that's Jesus? Anybody read through that the first time and thought that was Jesus? Why didn't we think about that being Jesus? Not a gotcha question here. Why not? Because it's a rock. And a rock's a rock. And we're reading our Old Testaments a lot of times like they're just history. And so they're things that happened. How many of y'all didn't like history because it's just names and dates? I assume the Crispells, they hated history. It's just names and dates, right? But it's not just history for them, is it? It's instruction. And that means it's not just about what happened. It's about what happens. It's about what's going to happen. And when Paul's reading that text, he's thinking about this. He's like, oh man, how many times in the Bible do we have God described as a rock? And you're like, it's a lot of times. It's all over the Psalms. It's in the prophets. God's a rock all the time. And then he's thinking, what do they do to that rock? What do they do to this rock that's just there to give them life and light and everything else? What does Moses do to it? He strikes it with a stick. And he's like, hey, what did the people do to Jesus? What does the centurion do at the end of his life as he's there on a tree? He strikes him with a stick. Now we're like, well, that's a spear. But to Paul, a stick's a stick, right? Like it's kind of like, if you got boys running around, anything can be a gun or a sword. It's like, it's a stick. No, it's not. It's a stick, right? And what comes out of Jesus, according to John? Not just blood, water. What comes out of the rock they strike in the wilderness? And what does it give the people? Life. And if you're Paul and you're talking to the people, you're like, how did you not see this was Jesus? And we're like, hold on, Paul, you mean we're supposed to be reading like that? What do you think Paul would say? Yes, Because he does it all the time, and he does it not in ways like, I'm going to blow y'all's mind, y'all have never heard this before. He's like, you should know this. Remember in Galatians 3 and 4, he's talking about Sarah and Hagar? Oh, I almost hung myself here. Sorry. Do you remember what he says about Sarah and Hagar? He says, these two women are actually what? Anybody remember? They're two covenants. They're two mountains. How many of us read through the story of Sarah and Hagar in Genesis chapter 16? We're like, this is about Mount Sinai and Mount Zion and about Christianity and Judaism, and it's really about Jesus. None of us. Don't worry. I'm not like pretending I did either, okay? But for Paul, he's looking for these sorts of patterns, and he's seeing them all over the place. And Jesus is expecting the church to do so as well. If you read at the beginning of Acts, when the people are experiencing persecution there in Acts chapter 5, do you remember what they do to figure out what they're supposed to do? They look to the Psalms, and they come across Psalm 2, and they're like, oh, of course, this is what's going to happen. This applies to us. Now, all of us, hopefully, search the scriptures to figure out what we're supposed to do. But a lot of times we're looking for very specific things, right? Like when we're looking through the scriptures, what are the kinds of things we're trying to figure out what to do? We're like, okay, how do I trust in God in this way? What sin am I supposed to, how do I pray more, right? Is that what the apostles were doing? A little bit. They get there, but they're saying, hey, how does God act in our lives? And how can I read myself into their story? Because the Bible may not be written to us, but it is written for us. We are part of the Bible story because it's not over yet. Jesus hasn't returned. And the reason this is for our instruction is not just so we can memorize Bible trivia games or memorize passages strictly for their own sake, but to see ourselves as part of God's divine story that begins with Adam and Eve and ends with the recreation of heaven and earth, and we're in the middle of it. And we need to see ourselves as part of that story. And that's what David has done. He's looked back to the history of the Exodus and he sees himself in that story. And we should as well. Because we can do something David can't. And that is that we can look forward from David and not just backwards to him. And it's a good warning for us, I think, in a lot of ways. David eventually, of course, does become king. And that's always a dangerous thing in the Bible. We may not think about it, but David is in far more danger when he's safe in a palace than he is when he's running from King Saul. David is far more in danger when things seem to be going well than when he knows they're doing poorly. Because we can see David as a type of Moses, where like Moses, he's a almost prophetic, almost priestly leader who brings God's presence into the camp, here for Jerusalem, there into Israel. He receives a special covenant, just like Moses does, and he helps prepare the house of the Lord. Does Moses build the tabernacle? No, but he helps prepare it. Does David get to build the temple? No, but what he helps is to get everything ready. Does Moses get to achieve, though, that thing that he's longed for and desired and put his entire life towards? Does he get to go into the promised land? Why not? Because he sinned. There's guilt in his hands. What does David long to do more than anything? But can he? Why? Why can't David build it? Because there's blood on his hands. He gets to look forward to it. He gets to prepare for it. He seeks it. He longs for it. But he doesn't get it. He's a little bit like Moses. He's a little bit like Joshua as well. If we'd had more time, we could look into this, but that's for y'all's own sort of a situation, where after he leaves the wilderness, he gains the land that God provides, and there's echoes of Joshua all throughout 2 Samuel. We're going to look at one example because it's too good to miss. Go over to 2 Samuel chapter 17. Do you remember when Joshua is going to go and conquer the land? The first thing he does is he sends what? spies. Now, Moses had sent 12 spies. That doesn't go well. There were only 2 good ones. So Joshua only sends how many spies? 2. He's like, let's hope these are both good ones. Where do they go? Do you remember? They go to Jericho. Yeah. And remember, someone sees them. Why don't they get killed in Jericho? Rahab hides them. Do you remember how she hides them? She covers them with, flax. Covers them with grain flax. When David is trying to recapture Jerusalem, in 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 17 and 19, take a guess at how many spies he's going to send. 2. They're going to get seen. But look at verse 19. Who saves them? And how?
Covering over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it, and nothing was known of it.
A woman saves them after they've been noticed by covering them with grain. A little bit of an echo. And even as we go through, though, the tragedy of David's life is that at the end of his life, he becomes a whole lot more like Pharaoh than he does like Moses. That he becomes king who seeks to take the wife of others, as Pharaoh did in Genesis. Or he enslaves the people some, as Pharaoh had done in Exodus. He sees and he takes like Achan does, and brings a curse and a plague on all of Israel. Because remember what happens in the end of his life after the census? He brings plagues on Israel where so many people die. That this idea, this concept, is that even at the end of David's life, the land's not quite at rest. But what we can do, as we've looked so long at David's life and back, I want us to look forward. Because it's not just an Exodus-shaped story. It's a cross-shaped story. Say that 3 times fast. Because ultimately, zeal for his house has consumed him, as Jesus would say about himself. And at the very end of his life, one of the last things he does is he comes about and he does a sort of exodus himself. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, when he's fleeing from Absalom, we read that he climbs the slope of the Mount of Olives and he starts to weep over the city because of what's about to happen to it. Do you remember what Jesus does as one of the last acts of his life in Luke chapter 19? He climbs on top of the Mount of Olives and weeps over Jerusalem about what's about to happen to it. Or do you remember in that same situation, who betrayed David that enabled all this to happen? Because Absalom's not viewed as a betrayer. Who betrayed him? It's a cool name. You got this. It's Bathsheba's relative, which should change the way we read that story. His name is Ahithophel. Do you remember what happens after Ahithophel realizes that God is with David and that his betrayal isn't going to work? He goes home, he gets his house in order, and he hangs himself. Who betrays Jesus? And after he realizes what's happened, he goes and he hangs himself. There's this concept that we look not only backwards, but forwards. That David is like Moses in the same way Jesus is going to be like Moses, but he's also looking towards Jesus. And even in these little elements and these stories, we should be looking to see that this is about Jesus. This is a quote. You don't have to memorize the whole thing or anything, but I liked how it talks about. There's this a biblical scholar, his name's Ron Hindle, and he's talking about how the Exodus is everywhere. Virtually every kind of religious literature in the Hebrew Bible, prose, poetry, prophecy, sees the Exodus as the most important thing. And where I like the end is that the past is never dead. It's never even past. I like that. Because the way that the biblical writers talk about the Exodus is not just as a past event, but it's a current one. And we can see it as a future one. Because we're in the midst of that story. We are in the wilderness longing for God's salvation. But what we can do is we can look at all the times God has saved people in the past, and take comfort, because you know what that means he's going to do for us? The same. When Jesus teaches the people how to pray, the Lord's Prayer that we can't pray because it says, your kingdom come. Have my own issues with that, just throwing that out there for something, so have y'all have something to get me in trouble for later. But do you remember what he prays? Give us this day our... And there's two ways to see that. What's the daily bread that Jesus is saying we should ask for in the wilderness? Jesus is the bread of life, but he's asking us to view it as manna in the wilderness. Because how long did that manna in the wilderness last? Oh, he gives it for 40 years, but it only lasts for. And what happens every day that you had to do again? Trust in God over and over and over. But did God provide for his people all the 40 years? Did their shoes ever wear out? Did their clothes ever wear out? Should they worry about what they're going to eat or what they're going to wear or where they're going to live? Jesus is saying to all of us in our prayers, remember the Exodus, because you are living in the midst of it still. That's all we got for now. Next time, I should have clicked through there. Next time, we're going to talk about the land of rest. You can think about something if you want. When is the Exodus over? Think about that question. When is the Exodus over? You can tell by the way we've answered that question. There's several ways to look at it, but we're going to talk about that some next week. So, break time, I think. Cool. 10-minute break. Think of. Thank you all so much.